Hello kids, this is Mr. Whistler with your video lesson of the day, and today we're going to be talking about the Boston Massacre. We have a couple of vocab words today, and the first one is propaganda. Propaganda is information designed to influence opinion. Stretching the truth to get people on your side. An example of this would be, imagine that if I hated Mr. Paulson, and I wanted you guys to hate him too. Well, say for instance, he kicked a kid out of his class, and the kid walked out of his room and went and sat down in a chair, and the kid started crying because he was sad. Well, I see this happen, and I want to influence you guys to hate Mr. Paulson, so I say, did you see what Mr. Paulson did? He actually picked up a kid and threw him out of the classroom. He rolled on the ground, hit the lockers, and started crying. That's not really the truth, but I stretch the truth to influence your opinion against Mr. Paulson. So the SIG for propaganda is the colonists used the news of the Boston killings to make everybody hate the British even more. Here's a picture of the Boston Massacre created by Paul Revere, a colonist and a son of liberty. Our second word is Committee of Correspondence. Now, the Committee of Correspondence was an organization that spread political ideas through the colonies. Now, if you look at this map, you have these cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and all these. They each had committees of correspondence. And the committees of correspondence were basically a system of communication in the colonies. If Boston had some important information they wanted the rest of the colonies to know about, they would send the information via horseback rider to New York City, and then they would pass it on to them, and these guys would make copies and pass it on to the people in Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia people would make copies and pass it on until all the colonies had the information. This was a good way to get important information throughout all the colonies, and it was a good way to unite the colonies. If you'll remember, the colonies weren't very united. In fact, the 13 colonies really didn't like each other that much, and these things that the British were doing to them helped them unite. And committees of correspondence was one of them. All right, building colonial unity. Now, this next incident is called the Liberty Affair, and this was one of the things that really united the colonists. Now, this guy right here, his name is John Hancock. And John Hancock's kind of famous for his signature. Here is a copy of the Declaration of Independence with John Hancock's name on it. And he wrote it really large. And he said he wrote it this large so the King of England could see his signature without his glasses. But this is one of the most famous signatures in American history because there's a saying that says, put your John Hancock on this, which means put your signature on it. So John Hancock is also synonymous with people's signature. Well, John Hancock was one of the richest men in Boston. He was a merchant. He had his own ship, and his ship was called the Liberty. And, you know, he did business. He transported goods back and forth from England, made a lot of money. Well, one day he had a ship full of wine, and he came up to the port of Boston and was unloading his wine. Well, British officials had got word that he was a smuggler and he used his ship to smuggle. So when they went to investigate, sure enough, John Hancock had wine, but he had all the paperwork to go with it. So in this particular instance, he hadn't smuggled anything, so he was not guilty. Yeah, John Hancock probably used his ship to smuggle, but they never caught him and they never had any proof. Well, in this situation, they didn't care. They seized his ship anyway with no proof. And this fired everybody up in the colonies. The colonists got mad and started protesting, and this was one event that really united the colonists. When word got out that this happened up in Boston, many of the other colonies were outraged as well. So they started protesting and in the streets, and these kind of protests made the British officials very nervous because if you'll remember from the Stamp Act, they went in and raided and destroyed British officials' houses. So they didn't want that to happen again, so they sent word to the king and parliament and told them that the colonies were on the verge of revolt. So parliament sent 2 regiments of troops to the colonies, and these troops set up camp right in the middle of Boston, on the Boston Commons, a big park right in the middle of Boston, which is still there today. Well, the colonists hated these soldiers. And the reason was these soldiers were mostly poor, didn't get paid very much, and they didn't have very good manners. They were rude, they were violent toward the colonists, they made the colonists mad because they were constantly jeering and saying rude things to them. Well, some of these soldiers even stole goods from local shops and competed for jobs with the colonists in the off hours. So everything these soldiers did kind of just rubbed the colonists the wrong way, and they just didn't like him. And they would get into scuffles with him all the time, and they'd be talking trash back and forth to each other. And the townspeople just hated them more and more every day. They just did not have a good relationship with the soldiers. Well, one day, March 5th, 1770, the tension reached a peak. A group of soldiers moved through the streets, and these were probably just young guys messing around, a group of them. They were out, they didn't have anything to do, and they were horsing around with each other. They'd grab sticks and hit each other with sticks. Well, they were walking around, and they turned a corner, and they see a single British soldier standing guard. So they decide that they are going to harass this British soldier because they hate him anyway. So they start throwing snowballs at him. Well, like any public incident, when people hear a commotion, they come over to see what's going on, and this crowd started to grow when people heard what was going on. And the sentry sees all these people coming, and he starts to panic, and he calls for more soldiers to come out and help him. Well, this thing turned into a mob, and the mob began picking up weapons they could find, like rocks or sticks, shovels, clubs, whatever they could find laying around, and a fight broke out between the townspeople and the soldiers. Well, here's a picture which kind of shows what I think really happened. This picture was actually painted like 100 years after the fact, but you can see here that the commander of the soldiers is out here. He has a sword out, but it's down, and he has his arm over here, and he's trying to control the crowd. This guy is a colonist. He has a club. You can see another colonist right here with the club, and the soldiers are just kind of basically trying to protect themselves. This is kind of after the shooting, because you can see guys laying here, but this is kind of a more realistic portrayal to me than others that I've seen. So the colonists, they're using their weapons. They begin taunting the redcoats to fire. They yell things like, "Bloody backs, lobsters, you dare not fire." They were saying things like, "I dare you to fire. Come on, go ahead." And they were hitting the soldiers with their sticks and their clubs. Then all of a sudden, one of the soldiers gets knocked down, and a shot goes off. And when one shot goes off with all these guys surrounded by colonists, then several more shots went off. It was like a chain reaction. When all the smoke cleared, there were 5 colonists laying dead on the ground. So this is the Boston Massacre. Was it a massacre? Were the British out there to try to kill as many people as they could? Did the British start it? No, the colonists started it, and the British were basically defending themselves. So the word spreads. The colonial leaders used this as an opportunity, used these killings as propaganda. Now here is the most commonly viewed picture of the Boston Massacre. This was created by Paul Revere, and he was the guy that warned the countryside that the British were out, the regulars were out, and he was a silversmith. Now this is actually an engraving of silver. So look in this picture. This is propaganda. The British soldiers are all lined up in battle formation. They all have their guns out. Look at the commander in this picture. He's back behind them with his sword up, commanding them to fire. Ready, aim, fire. Look over here. There's a little dog that's involved in it. There's a guy right here bleeding out of his head. And all these guys are laying down here. There's a woman over. There's even a woman over here watching this go on. Now, is this how it actually happened? No, but this picture is what they came up with to sway people's opinion against the British, and they were trying to get the colonists to hate them even more. So they called it a massacre, slaughter of innocent Americans by bloodthirsty redcoats. Now, were the redcoats bloodthirsty and looking to kill as many people as they could? No. Were the Americans innocent? No, they started the whole thing. The British, once again, were just defending themselves, and it did not look like this. Okay, so here's a picture of the guys that died. Crispus Attucks, African-American, was probably the first one that died. James Caldwell, Patrick Carr, Samuel Gray, and Samuel Maverick. The engraving by Revere showed British officer giving the order to fire. All right, the Boston Massacre with Paul Revere's engraving stirred up the colonists. So they were looking at this thing. Can you believe that they did this to us? I can't believe it. They're going to pay for this. So they called for strong boycotts. Now, these were the Boston Massacre. If you remember from yesterday, we discussed how the Townsend Acts were all repealed except for the one on T. It was really the Boston Massacre that allowed that to happen. It fired everybody up so much that they called for strong boycotts, and Parliament ended up repealing all the Townsend Acts except for the one on T. So the colonists lifted their boycotts after they repealed the taxes and started trading with the British merchants again, except for tea. So some people still wanted to resist the British. They wanted everybody to stay stirred up. Samuel Adams was one of these guys because he, I think, saw the bigger picture, and he wanted a revolution, and he wanted to become free of Britain once and for all. So this is when he came up with the Committees of Correspondence and started getting all that information to the other colonies about the Boston Massacre. And then once they had them set up, they used them to disseminate information throughout all the colonies whenever they needed important information passed along.